"That one," the Duke said, and the entire ballroom turned to stare at the woman no one had bothered to name. She stood at the edge of it all. The poor relation, the companion fetched to mind another ladies' fan, invisible in a borrowed gown 3 seasons out of fashion. They had spent the evening speaking across her as though she were furniture. Her own cousin had laughed, only an hour past, that she was useless, fit for nothing but the shadows. The Duke of Wexford crossed the floor and bowed to her. To her, why? Her cousin whispered, white-faced. She is no one, but the Duke knew something. Something about a fire 7 winters gone. Something about a sealed letter a dead earl had hidden, where grasping hands could never reach, and when he raised his head, he said the words that would unmake them all. The great hall at Ashmere had been scrubbed until it shone like a thing afraid of being judged. Every candle burning, though it was scarcely past noon. Every footman pressed flat as a card against the old oak panels, breath held, eyes front. The new earl wanted the room perfect. Worse than that, the new earl wanted to be seen wanting it perfect, and a house can smell the difference on a master the way a dog smells fear. They stood in a line for him, 6 of them, young, groomed, certain. Each one a steward or an agent or a man of business hired inside the last 6 weeks, each chosen for the cut of his coat and the depth of his bow, each believing, with the bright, unbroken confidence of men who have not yet failed at anything that mattered, that today the world would finally hand him the thing he had decided he deserved. Have you ever poured the whole of your life into one place? Your back, your eyes, the best years your hands ever had, and then found yourself stood in a corner of it, unnamed, while younger men were polished and arranged and presented as though you had never drawn breath under that roof at all? Hold on to that feeling. Because there was a 7th man in the great hall that noon, and he was not in the line, and the line had already forgotten he was there. He sat by the cold north window with an estate ledger open across his knees. An old man, spectacles low on his nose, a coat that had been good cloth once and was now only honest cloth, mended at the cuff by his own hand. He was not watching the door the great visitor would come through. He was watching a column of figures that refused to add the way figures are meant to add, and he frowned at it the way a younger man frowns at someone who has wronged him. His name was Walter Hartley. He was 68 years old. For 40 of those years he had been head steward of Ashmere Hall, which meant he knew where every drain ran and every gate sagged and every shilling went, and which meant, this particular winter, that he had come to know rather more than was comfortable for the men now running the place. They had taken the office from him in March, quietly, by a single folded letter. His lordship feels the burden of the estate would rest more naturally upon younger shoulders. No word of thanks in it, no pension named at the foot of it, only the cottage they had not yet contrived a reason to take from him, and the hint, dropped twice now, sweetly, that a man of his years would surely be more comfortable somewhere he was not forever underfoot, as though comfort and dignity were rooms you could be tidied into, what not one soul in that gleaming hall had thought to ask, what it would not have occurred to a single polished young man in that line to wonder, was that the forgotten figure by the window was the only person still living who knew what the late Earl had truly done with the western ground in the last quiet stretch of his life, and why a column that ought to have balanced had not balanced, not once, in 3 long years. The doors opened. He came in without ceremony, which was, in a man like him, its own variety of ceremony. The Duke of Wexford, tall, plainly dressed, gray coming in at the temples, a man who had owned more acres than every man in that line would see in a lifetime and had stopped, decades back, being impressed by any of it. He gave his gloves to a footman without troubling to look at the footman. He took 2 unhurried steps into the hall, and he stopped Crispin Marlowe, Earl of Ashmere, 24 years old, master of all this for not quite 10 months, came forward with his arms half spread. Your Grace, you honor Ashmere far beyond its deserving. The Duke let that hang a beat. We shall see what Ashmere deserves, my men, your Grace, a wave at the 6. 6 bows, drilled to the half-inch. My very best, whichever suits you, you have only to say the. I did not ride 40 miles for your best. The Duke's voice was not raised. It had never once in his life needed raising. I rode for the boundary at Holloway Brook, which your house and mine have quarreled over since before either of us was out of leading strings. There is one map that settles it and one set of papers that proves the map, and I mean to speak with the man who knows where they lie. A silence. The candle flames leaned, though no door had stirred them. Crispin laughed lightly, the laugh a man uses to set a crack back into a wall. Any of these gentlemen can surely, can they? Not a question? The Duke's eye went down the line, one at a time, slowly. The way a man counts coins he already suspects are short. The first young agent colored. The third found something urgent in his own boots. By the fifth, the hall had drawn so close that a maid behind the screens pressed her knuckles to her mouth. And then the Duke looked past them altogether, past the line, past the candleshine and the careful coats, to the cold north window, where an old man sat with a ledger and a frown and had not once raised his head. That one. Crispin followed the look and went first pale, then blotched. "Your Grace, that is no one. A former servant. We keep him on out of charity. He is old, he is— what do they call him, my lord? His own people. In the yard, in the kitchen. The word they use for him when he is not standing by to hear it." The Duke had already begun to move. "I have learned to listen for that word. It tells me more about a man than any coat his master can hang on him." And Crispin, cornered, contemptuous, dead certain it would shrink the old man and could cost himself nothing at all, said the word that would, in the end, cost him everything he had. "Useless, your Grace." "They call him useless." The Duke crossed the hall. The line of young men turned in a single startled ripple, looking from the great visitor to the corner and back again, as if the floor itself had tipped beneath them. He stopped before the window. He looked down at the old man and the column that would not close, and one corner of his mouth moved, just the once. "Bring me the one they call useless." Walter Hartley raised his head. For a long moment he said nothing, because a man who has been told for 3 months that he is in the way does not, at the first asking, believe he has been sent for. He glanced behind him, half sure the Duke must mean some other poor wretch. There was only the wall and the cold glass and the bare black trees. He set his spectacles straight. He closed the ledger on one finger to keep the place. Keep the figure, because the figure mattered more to him just then than the Duke did, and he could not yet have told you why, your Grace, the old man said. "I expect it's the Holloway survey of 79 you'll be wanting." "Not the new one. The new one was drawn to please someone. You could have heard a moth turn over in that hall." The Duke of Wexford studied him a long, considering breath. Then he did a thing no living soul at Ashmere had seen done to Walter Hartley in a decade. He inclined his head. At last he said, "A man who answers the question I actually asked." So that was the beginning of it. Not a trumpet. A word meant to wound, and an old man who quietly declined to bleed. But you must understand what had been built and unbuilt in that house, or none of what follows will sit where it ought. Walter Hartley had come to Ashmere as a young man with strong wrists and a level eye, back in the time of the present Earl's grandfather, and he had stood through 3 generations of Marlows the way a roof beam stands through 3 generations of a house, unremarked until the day it is gone. He had walked the boundaries in frost and in flood. He had set the rents fair in seasons when fair cost the family money, and argued the family round to it anyway. He had buried 2 wives in the village churchyard, and beside them a son, the small one, the one who came into the world too early and left it the same week. And of that grave he spoke to no one, not in 40 years, not once. He had a living son still, Thomas. 40 years old, a clerk in the county town, careful to a fault and frightened beneath the care, quietly ashamed of a father who smelled of stables and spoke to dukes as if dukes were merely tall. Thomas wanted him moved to a respectable set of rooms by the church, the kind where old men are stored and visited at Christmas. "It is for your own dignity, father." As though dignity could be packed in a trunk and carried somewhere safe. And he had a granddaughter, Lucy, 17, Thomas's girl, with her dead grandmother's quick hands and her grandfather's stubborn habit of walking toward the thing every sensible person was walking away from. She carried him bread when the kitchen forgot him. She sat on his cottage step and made him tell, again, how the great barn was raised the winter before she was born. When the March letter came that took his office, she had read it through twice and torn it cleanly in half, and said a word a girl of 17 has no business knowing, and Walter had pretended to scold her and had loved her so fiercely in that moment that his chest had ached with it. "They cannot do this," she had said. "They have done it, then we shall undo it, child." A man does not undo a thing by wishing at it. No. Her chin had come up, exactly as her grandmother's used to. He undoes it by knowing more than the men who did it. He had not answered her, because he had not yet understood that she was entirely right, and because the figure in the ledger had not yet begun to keep him awake at night. Here is the thing none of them in that bright hall understood. Not the line of young men, not the Earl. Not even, that first noon, the Duke. The old servant they kept on out of charity, the one already half packed off in their minds to the rooms by the church. He was the single living witness to a secret a dead man had hidden on purpose. And the men who had branded him useless were about to spend a great deal of cleverness, and rather more than they could afford, trying to bury the one person who could not be safely allowed to remember, the figure There it was again, the moment his mind was idle. He could not leave it be 3 years of estate accounts in which the rents from the western farms, Holloway, Penn's Acre, the long meadow under the ridge, came to the estate in some quarters and simply did not in others. And where they did not, the book said waste, unlet in default. Yet Walter had walked that ground every October of those 3 years. He had seen it green and worked and thick with fat sheep that wore no mark and answered to no name he could find written anywhere. Land that plainly earned, land the books swore was barren, a gap between the truth and the page. And a gap between the truth and the page is never weather, never accident. It is always a hand, and a hand in the end always belongs to a man. What no one at Ashmere had reckoned was that the relic by the window was the only person breathing who had read those books, with his eyes truly open. They thought him furniture. A heavy old piece not worth the trouble of moving. They had not stopped to consider that furniture. Left in one room long enough, learns precisely where each body in the house lies buried. The Duke wanted his survey. Walter rose, slow, one hip catching the long cold of the window in him, and the whole hall watched the relic get to its feet, and he went behind the screens to the muniment room, where the family kept its papers in iron-banded chests. Crispin came after him, fast. In a hiss pitched for one pair of ears, "You will give him last year's survey, the new one." "You hear me, old man?" His Grace asked for the true one. "I am telling you which one is true." Waldauer stopped at the muniment room door and looked at the boy who had inherited the lot and earned none of it, and his voice came out low and very kind, which is the most dangerous thing an old man's voice can do, my lord. "I have kept these papers since your grandfather was a young rake breaking horses on the long meadow. I will give his Grace the survey with the truth in it. The truth is the one servant in this house that has never yet been dismissed." Something small and ugly moved across Crispin's face. "You are very bold for a man whose cottage is not, in point of fact, his own. I'm aware of the cottage. Are you aware how easily a roof comes off an old head? There it was, out loud at last. And Walter, who had been threatened in his time by frost and flood and a loose bull and, once long ago, by a fire, discovered that he was not in the least frightened of a boy in a good coat, and was faintly ashamed of how little it cost him. "Take the roof, my lord," he said. "I have slept under worse than open sky. But the survey his Grace receives will be the one that tells the truth, and you and I will both have to live with whatever the truth chooses to do next." He went into the muniment room. Crispin did not follow him in. There are doors a man dares not pass, even doors he is certain he owns. He found the survey of 79 where it had lain 30 years. The linen-backed map, the Holloway line marked in the old surveyor's brown ink. The brook running where the brook in fact ran, not where last year's clean, pretty, lying new map had nudged it across by some 40 acres to flatter the Earl of Ashmere. He carried it out into the hall in both arms the way a man carries a sleeping child. The Duke spread it across the long table and bent low over it, and at his shoulder bent his own man. Price, Square, and the Duke's steward these 11 years, a fellow who missed nothing and announced less. The two of them traced the brook with their fingers, and the Duke made a sound low in his throat that was the sound of a 30-year argument finally closing. "There," he said, 40 acres. As I have said for 30 years and been called a liar to my face for saying." He straightened. He looked not at Crispin, but at the old man. "Who drew the new survey, Mr. Hartley?" The hall held its breath again, and Walter Hartley, who could have ended a young earl's pride in one clean sentence, who had every right and every fresh wound to do it, looked at the boy across the table and saw, beneath the contempt, something that surprised him. Fear, the cornered kind. And Walter had buried too many people to take any joy in cornering a living one, even this one. Not yet. Not until he was certain that, your Grace, I'd want to be sure of before I named a man to it. A crooked line may be a clerk's slip. I'll not hang a fellow on an ink blot. You are careful, the Duke said. I am old, your Grace. Careful is mostly what's left when the strength is gone. No, the Duke shook his head slowly, and now he let his voice carry. Meant the whole arranged glittering room to take it in. I have met careful men. Careful men hand me the survey that flatters whoever pays them. You handed me the one that costs you your roof. That is not careful, Mr. Hartley. That is a thing this country has very nearly forgotten the name of. Then he said, the thing Walter would turn over in the dark for nights after. Tell me, do you remember a fire? The hall went still in a different register entirely. Walter's hands, which did not shake, were of a sudden not quite his own. Your Grace? 7 years passed. The autumn fair at Brindley, the year the cornstalls caught. The whole crowd ran for the gate. You will not recall the man who ran the other way, into the burning, because that man did not linger to be thanked and could not be found when the crowd came back to its senses. The Duke watched his face. But I had a boy in that crowd, my sister's son, 8 years old, lost in the smoke. And a man came out of the flames with him, hauled up by the collar like a sack of meal, set him on his feet, and went straight back in for whoever else was screaming. Gone before a single person learned his name, the young men in the line had forgotten to be young men. They were only listening now. My steward there, a nod at silent price, spent the better part of a year running that name to ground for me. One name. He brought it back at last, and I wrote it in the front of the book where I keep the debts I intend to pay. It read, Hartley, steward at Ashmere. They call him useless. The Duke let it land. 7 years I have carried that contradiction. The truest thing my own steward ever watched a stranger do, and the man this house calls useless. I came today about a boundary. I confess I came also to learn which of those 2 men I should find standing here. Walter Hartley stood in the great hall of the house he had served 40 years, before a duke and a line of polished boys and the earl who wanted him gone, and found he could not at once speak, because no one in 7 years had told him that the worst hour of his life, the screaming, the smoke, the small body in his arms that was not, thank God, the small body in his own churchyard but might have been, so easily might have been, that hour had been seen, had been carried, had been written down by a great man among the debts that matter. It is not a thing a man chooses, your grace, he managed. You go toward the fire because there's a child in it. There's nothing in that to praise. And yet, said the Duke softly, 100 men chose the gate. You alone chose the fire. He rolled the survey and handed it to Price. I will not settle the Holloway line through the agents of a house that mislaid its only honest man. You will oversee the resurvey yourself, Mr. Hartley. My steward assists you. Lord Ashmere, I am sure, will be glad of it. Lord Ashmere did not look glad of it. Lord Ashmere looked like a man who has just felt the first thin crack run out across the ice he is standing on. The Duke left at dusk. The line of young men scattered like a flock that has lost its hedge. The candles were pinched out one by one, and the great hall went back to being only a great cold room. And Walter walked out into the blue evening toward his cottage, with the brown ink map still warm in his memory, and a small cold voice keeping pace at his shoulder. You will be made to pay for this, old fool. You and your truth, both. She was waiting on the step, Lucy, wrapped in her grandmother's shawl against the cold, her eyes huge in the half-dark. They're saying the Duke chose you, out of all of them. They're saying you gave him a map that. They're saying a great deal, by the sound of it. Grandfather, she caught his sleeve. Is it true he called you the truest thing his own steward ever saw? He lowered himself onto the step beside her. The first stars were pricking out over the long meadow. The meadow, the book swore was waste. He called me a contradiction, Walter said. That's nearer the truth of it. The truest thing in his book and the most useless thing in this house. Both at once, both with my name on them. He looked at his hands in the starlight, old hands. A burn-pale streak across the back of the right one, from a fire he had named to no one in 7 years. A man can be 2 things to 2 sorts of people, child. Hold on to that. What you are called is never anything more than the opinion of whoever happens to be doing the calling. Then I shall do the calling, she said fiercely. And I call you the cleverest man in this county, and I'd dearly love to watch the Earl try to argue it. He laughed, and it caught him off guard, and it loosened something that had sat tight in his chest since March. He ought to have sent her into her bed then. He ought not to have spoilt the one good evening. But 40 years of accounts had taught him that trouble never waits for a man to be ready, and that a person you love is safer knowing than kept in the dark, Lucy. The farms out west. Holloway, Penn's Acre, the long meadow there. He nodded at the dark green. The books call them waste, unlet, earning the estate nothing, and I've walked them, girl. They're worked, they're full. The land is earning, and what it earns never once reaches this house, and the page says there is nothing to reach. Her quickness, which was the best of her, had it at once. Then someone is, hush! Don't say the word aloud where the hedge can carry it, he pressed her hand. I don't yet know whose hand it is. Until I do, you and I say nothing and watch everything. You understand me, I understand. She was quiet a moment, then lower. Grandfather, if they learn that you know, then we shall be careful. He got up, the cold, the dark, go in. Your father will fret, she went, but she stopped at the door and looked back. 17, and afraid and brave in the way that has not yet learned free to be afraid of itself. Good night, truest thing in the Duke's book. Good night, cleverest girl in the county. He did not sleep. He lay in the cottage that was not his and listened to the wind work at the thatch, and somewhere in the small hours, with the cold, flat certainty of a man who has read figures half a century, he understood it. The boundary the Duke had crossed a county to settle, and the rents that bled away from those same western fields. They were not 2 troubles, they were 1 wound. the very same ground. Someone had shifted a line on a map, and someone had bled the takings from the land that line enclosed, and the two someones were almost surely a single someone, and that someone had just been ordered, in front of a duke, to stand back and let the old man walk every inch of the ground where the body lay. The summons came next morning, not from Crispin, from the oldest authority in the house and its sharpest tongue, the Dowager Countess of Ashmere, Adelaide, 71 years old, widow of the late earl, who had buried her husband 10 months past, and watched her great-nephew move into his rooms before the grass had so much as taken on the grave, and who had said almost nothing in the month since, in the manner of a woman storing every grain of it against a day she knew she would need it. She received him alone, in the small east parlor, with the door shut, which was not done. She did not ask him to sit. She looked at him out of eyes that had not dimmed when the rest of her had. "You gave Wexford the old survey." "I did, my lady. You know what sits on that western ground." A pause. "The clock." He chose the truth, because with this woman a lie would not have outlived the breath that carried it. "I know the books say one thing and the sheep say another, my lady. I don't yet know whose name is on the difference." "No, but you mean to find it. That is what I called you here to speak of." She leaned in, and her voice dropped to something that was not the gossip of a great house but the flat report of a sentry. "Yesterday, before the Duke had cleared the gate, my great-nephew sent a rider to the county town, to a man named Silas Crow, an attorney. You'll not have heard the name, you should learn it. He is not a kind man when he is set to a task. He finds things. He buries men in the things he finds. 20 years he has done it across 4 counties, and never once been thanked aloud, only paid very handsomely. In private, the cottage, the figure, the fire. It all turned slowly in Walter's mind and came to rest pointing one way. "What is Crispin paying him to find, my lady?" "You," she said it the way a door is shut. "He is paying Crow to find something, anything, to make the man the Duke just blessed look a thief, a liar, a creeping old fraud who should never have been let near the family's papers. They cannot simply turn you out now. The Duke has seen to that. So they will not turn you out. They will unmake you. They will arrange it so that when you stand to speak the truth about that western ground, not one soul in the shire will credit a word a disgraced old man has to say." She rose, came round the desk, and did a thing as unheard of as the rest. She laid her dry old hand on his arm. "I do not tell you this to frighten you, Mr. Hartley. I tell you so that when the blow lands, and it will land within the week, you do not mistake it for the truth. They are not afraid of what you are. They are afraid of what you remember." Her grip tightened. "My husband kept you 40 years for a reason he never named to me. I begin to think I know it now. Whatever he hid it close to you. Find it before Crow does. The man who holds the proof holds the house, and the man who loses it loses everything, his good name, his roof, and that bright-eyed girl who tears up letters on his step." Walter Hartley walked out of the east parlor into the gray morning with his heart going like a wright's hammer, and the whole shape of it, at last, laid plain before him. A line shifted on a map, rents bled into the dark. A duke's blessing that was also a brand burned across his back, an attorney already on the road to bury him. And somewhere near at hand, hidden by a dead man for reasons of his own, the one thing that could turn the whole of it over, timed it before Crow does. He did not yet know where to look. He did not yet know the half of what the late earl had done in the last quiet stretch of his life, far from this house, with a man of law and a sealed deed and a name set down that would, in its time, undo every certainty in this story. He knew only that the clock had started, that an old man they called useless had a week, perhaps less, before a stranger arrived to prove him worthless to the world. He stopped in the cold yard and looked back at the great house, gleaming and false, and he said the only prayer left to a man with nothing in his hands but his name. "Very well," Walter Hartley said. "To the morning, to the dead earl, to the boy in the churchyard and the girl on the step and the truth that had never once been dismissed. Very well. Come and try to take it then." And on the county road, in a plain dark coach, the man named Crow was already coming. Silas Crow came to Ashmere on the 3rd morning, and he did not arrive like a threat. That was the first thing a wise man learned about him, generally too late. A threat announces itself at the gate. Crow arrived like a spell of good weather, the kind that makes a farmer forget the barometer, a plain coach, a plain dark coat, a face arranged, feature by feature, for agreement. He stepped down into the yard and asked the stable boy his name and then used it and praised the set of the boy's shoulders. And by noon the whole servants' hall had decided the new lawyer was a proper gentleman, which was precisely the coin Crow had spent 20 years learning to leave behind him on every table he ever rose from. He took rooms in the east wing. He admired the dowager's roses, which were dead sticks for the season, and somehow the admiration still landed soft. He sat at the long table, where 2 days before a duke had unrolled a map that cracked the ice beneath an earl, and he opened a worn leather case and laid out his own papers in neat soldiers' rows, and he began, very pleasantly, to take Ashmere apart at the joints. He sent for Walter on the 4th day, by note. Mr. Crow would be grateful for a quarter hour of Mr. Hartley's long memory. Courteous as a snare is courteous, Walter went. Because a man who refuses to be looked at has already half confessed there is something worth the looking, Mr. Hartley. Crow rose, hand out warm as a banked hearth, the famous steward. They speak of you the way men speak of a landmark. Always there, always pointing the 110 direction. Landmarks get walked past, Mr. Crow. Do they now? The smile did not move a hair. I have found a man learns more from what is walked past than from what is admired. Sit, please. Walter sat. He set his hands flat on his thighs and waited, the way he had waited out bulls and bailiffs and 3 bad harvests, and let the attorney's silence do its own honest share of the labor. I am merely putting his young lordship's affairs in good order. Crow began. A formality, 3 generations of accounts, tedious work, and in the tedium one turns up the oddest small things. He drew a single page free, reluctantly, the way a man draws a splinter. The cottage on the Brindley Lane, the one you have of the family. Charming little place. Were you aware there is a charge against it? Walter's pulse did a thing his face did not. The cottage is the family's, Mr. Crow. Not mine to charge, just so. The cottage is the family's. Crow nodded, agreeable, lethal. But there is a private note, old, 18 years back, a sum borrowed against the only security a man without land can offer, his future wage. His good name signed away, a pause soft as wool laid over a blade, doctor's bills, I believe, a long illness, a wife who did not, in the end, mend. Forgive me, I do not raise it to wound, he raised it for nothing else, and it found the place it was aimed at, because the second Mrs. Hartley had taken 2 winters to die, and the physician had come from the county town through deep snow at a guinea, the visit, and Walter had borrowed against his wage from a moneylender in that town, because there had been no other way under heaven, to keep her warm and dosed and gently leaving, and he had paid it down, a little each quarter for 18 years quietly, the way a proud man pays for his grief in installments. I have never missed a payment, no. You have not. A most honorable record. Crow slid the page back into its row, having let Walter see only its edge, which was the whole of the art. But the note may be called at the holder's pleasure. Were it called, were the full sum demanded at once, a man of your means could not meet it. And a man who cannot meet his debts, Mr. Hartley, is a man whose word, sadly, carries no weight at all. Not in a court. Not before a duke. Not anywhere it might matter. The smile reached, at last, its full and dreadful warmth. I tell you only as a kindness, so that you might set your affairs straight while there is time. Walter looked into the pleasant face and understood, all in one cold instant, that he was not being warned. He was being shown the rope, and invited to stand back and admire the knot. You bought my note. His lordship, said Crow, is as a journalist eager to relieve old servants of old burdens, and were I to give up my place. Drop this nonsense of the western farms. Take the rooms by the church, my son keeps pressing on me. Then I should think the note need never trouble you again. Some debts, Crow said, gathering his case, gentle as a priest, are forgiven the very hour a man ceases to be inconvenient. Walter rose. He looked down at the attorney and kept his voice level, because level was the last weapon in that room that still belonged to him, Mr. Crow. I have buried 2 wives and a child, and I have paid every farthing I ever owed, in coin and in grief, on the day, in full. You will not be the man who teaches me what a debt is, I should not presume, said Crow, and smiled, and won the round all the same. Because Walter walked out with his hands unsteady, and Crow sat down to his neat rows entirely calm. And that was the whole distance between a man who holds the rope and a man who has only just felt it touch his neck. That night the not sleeping had teeth. 18 years. A note he had hidden even from Lucy, even from Thomas. A small private shame folded away in a drawer of himself, and now a stranger held it in a leather case and could pull it taut whenever the pulling served. Think, he had to think. Except thinking kept sliding off the note and onto the snow, the guinea of visit, the way she had grown so light toward the end. Light as no, not that, not now. The note, who held it? What could be? Stop, breathe. A man does not close a sum with his heart going like that. Add it as you'd add any column. Slow, honest. Carry what won't carry. He was still adding it at first light when Lucy came with the bread, and behind Lucy, unlooked for, came a person he had not sent for. Margaret Sutton, 25. The late Earl's goddaughter, reared half at Ashmere and half in the Brindley rectory, a plain, watchful, unmarried woman the new regime had shelved as briskly as it had shelved the old steward. For a goddaughter with opinions is exactly as welcome to a grasping young earl as an honest ledger. She had her godfather's gray eyes and his trick of saying the unwelcome thing in the gentlest possible voice. She was, as it happened, Lucy's godmother too. She had stood at the font for the girl 17 years before, when Walter's own wife still lived, and had never once let the connection lapse, whatever the family thought of the people she kept it with. Mr. Hartley, she wasted no greeting. Lucy tells me there is a lawyer taking the estate apart, and that he has set his teeth in you. I want to know what he has found, and then I should like to help you bury it back where it came from, Miss Sutton. This is no fit business for a woman, a goddaughter, a person with nothing left to lose, the whole of her prospects having already been quietly removed. She set a small bundle of papers on his table with a precision that was its own argument. My godfather kept his secrets close, Mr. Hartley, but he never kept them from his God, and he kept far fewer of them from me than this house imagines. In his last years he spoke to me as of things he was setting right, quietly, a long way off. I understood not the half of it. I begin to think you might understand the rest, his last years. The far off, the unclosing column, the shifted line, the bled rents. Walter felt the separate pieces he had carried alone for 3 years tip, all at once, toward a single shape, sit. Both of you. Shut the door, Lucy. The window too, and then, because the dowager had been right, that the people you love are safer knowing than guessing, and because 2 more honest pairs of eyes outweighed his pride, he told them the whole of it. The western farms green, where the books swore them barren, the takings that came and were entered as never come. The boundary nudged 40 acres on a pretty new lie of a map. Crow's leather case and the 18-year-old note asleep inside it. The rope, the knot, the invitation to admire the work. When he finished, Lucy was white to the lips and Margaret sat very still. And it was Margaret who spoke first, in the gentle voice that always carried the hard thing. Then he will not stop at the cottage. A man who buys your debts means to call them. The note is not the weapon. The note is the gag, the thing that keeps you quiet while he finds the real one. She looked at Walter levelly. What is the worst the books could be made to say of you? There it was. The figure he had been refusing to add to the column. That I took it, he said slowly. The missing rents. That the hand bleeding those farms was mine. I keep the books. I have always kept the books. Who in this county would not believe the man with the pen took the coin? His own voice frightened him. God help me. They need not find a thief. They need only make one, because that was the shape entire. The boundary, the rents, the debt, the lawyer, every piece bending toward one end. To take the single old disgrace already buried in his name and heap 100 fresh ones on top of it, until the truest thing in a duke's book was the most discredited man in the shire. Then we do not wait for the blow. Margaret said, no, and the old steadiness came back into him as he said it, the going toward the fire steadiness, the only sort of courage he had ever owned. A debt confessed is only a debt discovered is a noose. I'll not be hanged on my own rope while I've breath enough to cut it. He would go to the Duke. Not to beg, to tell. He would lay the 18-year note on the table with his own hand, before Crow could spring it and the bled rents beside it, and let the great man hear the whole of it from the mouth of the man it concerned. Plainly, and nothing hidden. Because the one thing a noose cannot do to a man who has already shown the world his bare neck is take him by surprise. The Duke of Wexford had come back to oversee the resurvey, as he had said he would, and lodged not at Ashmere, but at his own hunting box 6 miles off, sending Price out each morning to pace the disputed ground with Walter and a measuring chain. So it was to Price that Walter spoke first, and Price, who missed nothing and announced nothing, took one look at the old man's face and went straight to his master. That same evening Walter stood in a low oak room with a fire snapping in the grate, and the Duke watching him from a worn leather chair. You asked for me, Mr. Hartley. Price says it would not keep. It will not, Your Grace, because if it keeps, another man tells it first, and tells it crooked. Walter did not sit. He took the 18-year note from inside his coat, where it had ridden against his heart all that day, and set it on the small table between them, and made himself say the shame aloud. 18 years ago I borrowed money I could not easily repay, to keep a dying woman warm. I pledged my wage and my name for it. I have paid it down each quarter since, and never once defaulted. I tell you because Lord Ashmere's attorney has bought the note and means to call it, and a man whose debts are called has a word worth nothing. I would sooner you heard the worst of me. From me, he drew breath. And there is worse coming, which is none of my doing but will be dressed to look it. The western farms of this estate are worked and earning, and the books say they earn the house nothing, and I keep those books, so when the lie is sprung, it will wear my own hand. I did not take a farthing, Your Grace. I cannot yet prove who did. I can only give you the truth, and warn you that the truth and I are about to be made to look like strangers." The fire snapped. The Duke did not move for a long moment, and Walter felt the whole of what remained of his life balance on a great man's quiet. "You came," the Duke said at last, "to confess a debt no man had yet charged you with, and a theft no man had yet laid at your door, on the bare chance it might let me hear the truth before the lie reaches me. Yes, your grace, my father left me debts, Mr. Hartley, not your kind. The grand kind, the sort that come with a title and a great house, and no instruction at all on how to carry either. I spent the first years of my own holding doing nothing but learning whose hand had emptied what, while every soul about me bowed and lied and reached for the next thing within reach. His voice had gone somewhere far off. I learned in those years to tell two men apart, and only two, the man who hides the difference, and the man who lays it on your table before you can find it yourself." He rose. He looked at the note and did not touch it. "A guilty man does not bring me the rope, Mr. Hartley. He prays nightly that I never think to open the case. Then you believe me. I believe that whatever your books are about to swear, I shall want to hear what you swear before I credit a syllable of it. That is not proof. Bring me proof and I will be your shield in any court in England. Until then." And here his eyes went hard, not at Walter, but at the thing he could feel closing around the old man. "Until then, walk soft. They have shown you the rope. That means the trap is already built, and they are only waiting on you to take the step into it. Do not give them the step." So Walter walked back out into the dark with the note over his heart again, and with something he had not owned in 3 years, a second man who knew. Not a rescue, not yet, but a witness with a duke's weight behind him. And to a man being quietly fitted for the gallows of his own good name, a witness is no small thing in the world. It should have bought him a week. It bought him 3 days, because Silas Crowe was not a man who sprang his traps on his own calendar. He sprang them the instant he learned the quarry had reached the huntsman. And learn it he did. A groom at the hunting box, a coin pressed into a palm, a whisper carried back over 6 dark miles, the cheap, reliable machinery by which all such men have always worked. Crowe understood at once what it meant. A debt confessed to a duke is a debt with its teeth drawn. The old fool had reached into his own jaw and pulled the very tooth Crowe had meant to bite him with. He sat a while with that, in the cold, neat order of his East Wing room, and felt no anger, because anger was a waste a man in his trade could not afford. He felt only the small adjustment a chess player feels when a piece he had counted on is quietly removed from the board. Very well, the debt was spent. He had been paid to bury a man, and a man may be buried in more than one kind of earth. He went to the long gallery, where Crispin was admiring a portrait of an ancestor who would not have admired him, and for the first time since his coach had rolled into the yard, Silas Crowe let the good weather drop entirely from his face. "The note is dead, my lord. He has carried it to the Duke himself." "He what?" The boy's certainty wobbled. "Why would a man confess? Because a confessed sin cannot be revealed. He has thought ahead of us." Once, Crowe let the once sit, which is 1 time more than I generally permit a man to do. "We will not threaten him again, my lord. Threats are for men whose silence we still want. We no longer want his silence." He smiled, and there was nothing behind the smile at all, only a clerk totting up a sum in ruined men. "We want the county to stop its ears the moment he opens his mouth. And there is one charge that does that to an old steward more surely than any other, and it is sitting already in the very books he is so proud of keeping." Embezzlement, Crispin breathed, and the greed and the relief in him were a sickening thing to watch bloom together. 3 generations of accounts in a single hand, said Crowe softly, and only one man alive who claims to read them. We shall simply help him to be read. It came on the 4th day, in the great hall, with witnesses arranged as carefully as the candles had been arranged for the Duke. Crispin presiding, pale and bright about the eyes. Mrs. Hadley, the housekeeper, summoned and trembling at the edge of it. The county magistrate present, a soft, heavy man named Pruitt who owed the Marlowes the living he sat in, and on the long table, open damning, 3 estate ledgers in Walter Hartley's own unmistakable hand. Mr. Hartley, Crispin's confidence was back, and it was an uglier thing for having been frightened. "Mr. Crowe has completed his review of the accounts. The findings are grave, I am sorry to say. They concern the Western rents you have been so very eager to discuss." Crowe came forward, sorrowful, masterly. "It pains me, sir, it truly does. But books do not lie." He turned a page with one careful finger. "Holloway, Penn's Acre, the Long Meadow. Rents received in full, quarter upon quarter, here in your hand, Mr. Hartley, and record 2 leaves on, as waste, unlet, in default. The sums collected appear in the estate's receipts nowhere at all." He looked up, the very picture of grief. "Nowhere, that is. But the pocket of the man who held the pen, Walter stared down at the pages, and his blood turned to river ice. Because the entries Crow pointed to, the rents received set down in his own hand, he had never written. He had written waste. He had written unlet. Those were his true entries, his honest bafflement laid down in black ink 3 years running. But some hand had been into the book since, and added, in the line above each, a receipt, a collection, a confession, in a script so like his own it might have been penned by his ghost. They had not forged a stranger's hand, they had forged his. They had taken his honest record of a crime and turned it into the crime's own signed admission. "That is not my writing," Walter said, and heard, even as it left him, exactly how it sounded. The thief's first sentence. The oldest line spoken in any courtroom in the world. "It is remarkably like it," murmured Crow. "It is meant to be. Some hand has, yes." Crow almost smiled. "The hand of the only man who has kept these books for 40 years and who has told a great many people that he alone can read them. Your own words, Mr. Hartley. I am merely the fellow who finally took you at them. The cleverest lie," Walter understood with a lurch that was almost physical, "is the one that wears your own hand to the gallows." He had spent his whole life being the single man who could read these accounts, and Crow had made that very mastery the proof of his guilt. The witness had been melted down and reforged into the weapon. Pruitt, the magistrate, cleared his soft throat. "These are weighty matters. Embezzlement of an estate sustained over years. If the figures bear it out, they bear it out," said Crispin, who had not once stopped watching Walter's face with a hunger that gave the whole game away to any honest soul in the room. And there was no honest soul in that room who also held any power. "Pending the inquiry, Mr. Hartley is of course dismissed from every dealing with this estate. The resurvey proceeds without him, and the cottage, the smallest, sweetest pause, the cottage, charged against debts he plainly cannot meet, reverts to the family. He will quit it by week's end." Walter looked for the one shield he had bought. But Price was out on the western ground with the chain, 6 miles gone, and the Duke was at his own table, and a Duke cannot stand surety for a man the very hour a magistrate's eye is on him without it looking like the great trampling the law. The Duke's own warning came back, cold as the ice in his chest. Walk soft. He had walked soft. He had confessed the note, drawn the threat's teeth, done every single thing right. And Crow had simply raised a second gallows in the shadow of the first. It was Mrs. Hadley, 30 years a servant of that house, summoned to witness and shaking, who broke the silence and broke Walter's heart along with it. "Mr. Hartley would not," she whispered. "I've known the man 30 year. He would not." "You may step down, Mrs. Hadley," said Crispin. And she stepped down, and that was the true measure of how far the cold had reached into the house. That 30 years of a woman's certainty could be waved off the floor with 4 words and the flick of a young hand. They put him out of the great hall, and in the yard, where a duke had inclined his head to him not 5 days before, a small knot of servants stood with their eyes on their boots, and the word that had been only a careless cruelty before, useless, took on a second meaning between one morning and the next, and the second meaning was thief, and a thief is a thing men are permitted, even encouraged, to despise. He found Thomas at the cottage, his son, come up from the county town with the news already run ahead of him on faster legs than his, the careful, frightened face gone past fright, into something worse. "Is it true?" Not a question Thomas wanted answered. A wall he wanted to lean against. "Father, the whole town has it. Embezzlement. Years of it. They are saying you will be tried, father, at your age, our name read out in the assize court." "It is not true, Thomas. The books were altered. Some hand forged my—" "Of course you would say that, and there it was. The flinch. The hand that did not reach. You always have an answer. The Duke, the boundary, the western farms, always some grand design only you can see. And now this, and it is in your own writing, father, your own hand." His voice cracked, and the crack was not love. It was shame. Bare and undignified. "I have a position. I have a daughter to see settled. I will not be the son of a man dragged through the assizes as a thief. Take the rooms by the church. Go quietly. For Lucy's sake, if not your own. Stop fighting a thing you cannot win. And leave what is left of our name in peace. There is a particular cold in being buried by a hand you once held while it learned to walk." Walter felt it close over him, crown to heel. He had carried this man as an infant through a fever that should by rights have taken him. He had taught this man to fish the Holloway Brook in the years before a lying map had ever shifted it an inch. And here that man stood in his doorway and asked him, for the sake of a good name, to confess by silence to a crime he had not done. "And if I go quietly," Walter said, very low, "the man who bled those farms keeps the farms, and keeps you believing your father a thief, and comes, one day, for whatever you have managed to put by. Because that is the nature of such men, Thomas. They never stop at one old fool. They cannot. It is not in them. Better a quiet lie than a loud ruin. Thomas would not meet his eye. I am sorry, father, I am. But I am taking Lucy back to town with me. Tonight. I'll not have her under the roof of I'll not have her here, that landed where none of the rest had. You will not take that child from me on the strength of a forged ledger. I am her father. And the door, when Thomas left, did not slam. It closed soft and final, which was worse. The way Crow's mildness was worse than any shout. The way the quietest things in this story always cut the deepest. So this was the floor of it. Walter Hartley stood alone in a cottage that would be the family's again in 4 days. Dismissed in disgrace, branded a thief in his own hand, his one shield held off by the very law that should have lifted it, his granddaughter to be carried away by dark, his son turned witness for the men who hunted him. Out of fear, which is the only motive that ever truly wounds, because you cannot even hate it cleanly. And somewhere in the great house, a young earl and a smiling lawyer raised a glass, no doubt, to a clean morning's work. If you have come this far through the cold with an old man, stay with him a little longer through the dark. Because what Walter Hartley did next, with everything taken and 4 days left on the clock, is the part not one soul in that gleaming house ever saw coming. He sat down at his bare table, he lit his last good candle, the long one he had been saving for he knew what, and he did the thing he had done all his life when the column would not close, and the bull was loose in the lane, and the corn was already burning. He stopped grieving the loss, and he started reading the difference. They could take the office, they had. They could take the cottage, they would. They could take his good name, and his son's belief, and even, God forgive them, the daughter of his own son for a season. But they could not take the 40 years. Those were spent. Those were paid in. Those were his force. In 40 years of guarding one dead man's secrets, Walter Hartley knew a thing Silas Crow could never forge, because Crow did not know it existed. He knew where the late Earl had gone, that last quiet stretch of his life, and very nearly why. A man far off. A sealed paper, a name. Margaret Sutton had as good as handed it to him across this very table, and he had been too busy bleeding to take it. The cottage door opened before her father's cart could come. Lucy. White-faced, a small bundle clutched to her, and she pressed something into his hands before he could find the breath to send her away. A small iron key on a faded ribbon, and a folded scrap in a hand he knew. Miss Sutton sent it. My godmother. Lucy's whisper shook. She said you would know the lock. She said to tell you, a swallow, that the answer was never at Ashmere at all. It was somewhere your master could set it down where this family's hands would never reach. And she said to hurry. Walter looked at the key lying across his old, scarred palm, and for the first time since the great hall, the cold went out of him, and something far older and a great deal harder moved in to take its place. Go with your father tonight, he told her, gentle and fierce both at once. Be patient. Be quiet. Trust your grandfather one more season than is reasonable. He closed his fist over the key. They have shown the whole county a thief, and I am about to show it the one thing they none of them remembered a useless old man could still be made into. And what is that? She whispered. A witness, said Walter Hartley. With proof? The cart took Lucy down the Brindley Lane at dusk, and Walter Hartley stood in his doorway and watched the small straight shape of her refuse, the whole way, to look back, because he had begged her not to, because one backward glance from that child would have unmade him on the spot. Then the lane was empty. Then the cottage behind him was a thing already half surrendered. And then, alone, in the dark, the old man closed his fist around the key on its faded ribbon and let himself, for the space of 1 minute and not a heartbeat longer, be afraid. 1 minute. He counted it the way he counted everything in his life, slow, even, honest. And when it was spent, he wiped his face on his sleeve and lit the candle and looked at the key, and the fear had not gone, but it had stopped being the master of the room. The Dowager Countess came to him after dark, on foot, alone. A great lady of 71 walking a frozen lane with a swinging lantern, because there was no servant left in a turned house she would trust with the errand. She did not knock. She came in and set the lantern on his stripped table beside his guttering candle and looked at him out of those undimmed eyes. They have made you a thief in a single morning, she said. I have walked here to remind you what took 40 years to make, because 40 years does not unmake in a morning whatever a frightened magistrate decides to write down. They have taken Lucy from me, my lady. They took her at dusk, for a season, not forever. A frightened son is not a lost one, only a man who has not yet been shown which fear is the larger. She lowered herself into his one-sound chair, slow, her bones like dry reed under the silk. Now hear me, Mr. Hartley, for I did not walk a frozen lane to comfort an old man. I walked it to tell you the rest of what my husband did. Her voice dropped to something between a confession and an oath. He bought the Western Farms himself, near 40 years past, with his own money, not the estate's. Holloway, Penn's acre, the long meadow. They were never tied into the entail. They were his, free and clear, to do with as he pleased. And what pleased him at the last was to keep them out of one particular pair of hands. The key seemed to warm against Walter's palm. "Whose hands, my lady?" "My great-nephew's." She spoke the name of her own blood, the way a woman speaks of a thing she has already finished mourning. Crispin. My husband read the boy true years before the rest of us would let ourselves. Saw the greed in him, the soft, patient cruelty. He said to me, in his last years, "I will not leave a grasping child the means to grind the people of this land into his own comfort." And then he went very quiet and very calm, and he made his arrangements a long way from this house, with a man of law he trusted. 3 years, I think, before the end. And he set the key to those arrangements in the hand of the one soul under this roof he trusted above his own name and blood together. She looked at the key in Walter's fist. "He never told me it was you," she said. "He never needed to. There was never anyone else it could have been." So Walter understood at last and entire why he had been kept on 40 years for a reason no living mouth could name. He had been kept because a dying man, looking clear-eyed at the people who would inherit his name, had needed one honest pair of hands somewhere in the house. And an honest pair of hands, he had learned across a long life, is the rarest furnishing any great house ever holds, and the first thing the next generation always tries to throw out. 3 years before the end, Walter said slowly, and the figure that had refused to balance for 3 years running turned over in him and showed, for the first time, its true and gentle face. "My lady, the books. The Western rents the estate never saw, 3 years running, that I set down as waste. You set them down honestly," the dowager said. "The estate truly received nothing. Now go and learn where it went instead, before the man with the leather case learns it first. And Mr. Hartley," she rose, and at the door she paused, and the lantern caught the iron in her. "When you have it, do not whisper it, do not creep. My husband did not trust a creeping man with the people of this land. Stand up in his hall and say it out loud." The key fit no lock at Ashmere. He had known that the instant his fist closed on it. The wards were strange to him, and he knew every lock on the estate the way a man knows his own teeth. Margaret's note had said it plain. The answer was never at Ashmere at all, somewhere this family's hands could not reach. And there was only one such place within a day's walk of a man who could not afford a horse. The place that had half-raised Margaret Sutton herself. The rectory at Brindley and the old grey church beside it, and the locked oak chest in the vestry where the parish had kept its plate and its registers 200 years. Where a careful earl might leave a careful thing under the eye of a clergyman, who owed the Marlowes nothing and his maker a great deal. He went at first light, the long way round, through the white frost, his old hip catching at every stile, because a man freshly branded a thief does not walk the open road in daylight. The rector met him at the vestry door without the least surprise, like a man keeping an appointment set down years before. Margaret was already there, and on the scrubbed oak table sat a small iron dispatch box, black with age. The key turned, the lid lifted, and Walter Hartley looked down into the last careful year of a dead man's conscience, a deed. Folded in heavy linen paper, sealed with the earl's own ring, and beneath it a letter in the failing beloved, unmistakable hand of the master he had served 4 decades. Walter's eyes blurred, and he was furious at them for it, and he read on through the blur regardless. "Hartley," it began. "Not Mr. Hartley, just the name a man uses for a friend. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and they have begun to do to you the thing I always knew they would do the moment I was cold. They will say you took what you guarded. It is the oldest trick small men own, to point at the watchman and cry thief." Walter's breath caught and held. "I have put the Western Farms beyond their reach. The deed beneath this letter conveys Holloway, Penn's acre, and the long meadow into a trust I settled 3 years since with my man Galbraith. Irrevocable, witnessed, and lawful past any unpicking. I have named you its trustee. I named you because in 40 years I never once knew you to keep a farthing that was not yours. And because I once heard tell of a fair at Brindley where a man walked into the fire after a child not his own and would not stay to be thanked for it. I will trust the man who carried a stranger's child out of the flames over the man who happens to carry my name. The rents of those farms are to keep the trust, and the trust is to raise a school for the parish poor, and to keep you, old friend, in your cottage and your dignity to your last day. Galbraith holds the originals and his sworn word, and is waiting on your letter. Stand up, Hartley. You always could." Walter Hartley sat down hard on the vestry bench, because his legs had stopped being willing to hold a man this undone. and the whole monstrous machine of it turned over in the cold gray light and showed him, finally, its underside. Now he understood the books. The Western rents that the estate had not received these 3 years, that he had set down in his own honest hand as waste, unlet. He had been right, every quarter of it. The estate received nothing because the money was never the estate's to receive. It was the trust's. It had been flowing, quietly and lawfully, to a man in Edinburgh and a school not yet built, and an old man's promised dignity, for 3 years by a dead earl's design. There had been no thief in those 3 years at all, only a mercy the bookkeeper had not been told the shape of. And Crispin. Crispin had come into the title 10 months past, and found land that plainly earned, and money that never once reached his hand, and no thread in the estate books to follow. Because the thread ran north, to Edinburgh, to Galbraith, to a trust the boy had never dreamed his great-uncle had made. So the grasping child had done the one thing a grasping child knows to do with money it cannot trace and cannot bear to see escape it. He had reached out and seized it. Not for 3 years. He had not had 3 years. He had had 10 months, 3/4 of skimming the trust's own rents into his own purse before they could reach the north, stealing, in the plainest words the law owns, from a charity for the parish poor, and then, when an old man's stubborn questions about those very fields threatened to drag the hidden thing up into the daylight, he had reached for Crow and forged the watchman into the thief, exactly, to the letter, as the dead man's letter had foretold he would. They called the missing rents my theft, Walter said aloud, to the vestry, to the silent rector, to Margaret Sutton, standing white and fierce by the cold altar. For 3 years they were no theft at all. They were my master's mercy, on its way to children not yet born. And in 10 months that boy has been robbing a school for the poor and dressing me in the crime to keep his own hand out of the light. Then send for Galbraith, Margaret said. The proof has sat in Edinburgh, sworn and sealed while ye bled. But a letter to Edinburgh and its answer carried back was a full fortnight's business, on the best roads in a dry season, and this was neither. The trap, by contrast, allowed him 4 days. 4 days until the cottage reverted and the inquiry hardened from a question into an indictment with his name set at the head of it. A fortnight the journey demanded. 4 days the trap permitted. The 2 figures would not be made to balance, however he turned them, and this time the figure that refused to close was not a column of rents. It was the remainder of his own life. It was the Duke of Wexford who closed the gap, and it was Price who wrote it shut. Walter went to the hunting box that same night with the deed and the letter wrapped flat against his heart, and laid them before the great man a second time, and this time the Duke did not keep to his chair. He read the dead Earl's letter standing at the fire, once, and then again, slower, and when he looked up, his face had gone to the still, cold fury of a man who has spent his whole life among the powerful, and has never quite finished being sickened by what they will reach for. A school for the poor, he said, very quietly. He has robbed a school for the poor and hanged his great-uncle's friend to cover the taking of it. He folded the letter with great care, the way a man folds a thing that must survive a courtroom intact. Price, use grace to Edinburgh. Within the hour, my own horses the whole road, and relays standing where I keep them, change them till they drop and damn the cost to me. Galbraith, the late Earl's man of law. I want the originals of this trust and his sworn statement certified before a magistrate in his own city, and the trust's own accounts of every rent it ever received. You will not sleep, and you will not stop, until they are against your ribs and your horses pointed south again. His eyes did not leave Walter. And as you go, send word ahead by the mail that Galbraith is to follow you down by the fastest chaise his age will bear. I want the man in the room, not only his paper. I will be back in 4 days, said Price, who had not spoken 20 words in as many days, and made each one carry its full freight, and was gone before the door had finished its swing. As for the 4 days, the Duke said, turning to Walter, they are mine now, not Crow's. I will go to Pruitt tonight. A magistrate may take a forged ledger from an attorney. He may not sign a committal against a man a duke has told him to his face that he vouches for, not while the Duke swears, on his name, that the documents which clear him are already on the North Road. Pruitt owes the Marlowes a living. He owes me his hope of ever sitting at a quarter sessions I attend. We shall see which debt he finds the heavier when both are laid on his desk together. So began the longest 4 days of a long life. The cottage emptied around Walter under the indifferent eyes of 2 of Crispin's men, his few honest sticks of furniture carried out and stacked in the lane like a poor man's funeral. The county's gaze followed him everywhere, the way a smell follows a man. In the village, mothers drew their children a step closer as he passed. The word that had meant only old and then meant thief now sat on every tongue at once. and he carried it down the frozen street with his back held straight, because a bent back would have looked like a confession. And his straight back was the one honest thing they had not yet found a way to take from him. And Crow felt the turn. Of course he felt it. A man who has buried other men 20 years knows in his skin the particular hush of a grave that will not fill. He had heard things. A clergyman, a vestry, an old iron box opened at first light. He had heard that the Duke's silent steward had ridden north out of the county at a pace that killed horses. He went to Crispin in the long gallery, where the boy was again admiring the ancestor who would not have owned him, and for the second time Silas Crow let the good weather fall clean off his face. "There is something in Edinburgh, my lord. Your great-uncle's man of law. If the old steward has laid hands on a deed, my great-uncle left the whole of it to me." Crispin had drunk to a clean morning and could not now make his mind hold an unclean one. "There is no deed. There is no Edinburgh. There is a senile old thief and a duke with a soft spot for charity cases. There is a horse on the north road that says otherwise. And if it comes home before the inquiry shuts, then shut the inquiry sooner." The boy's voice climbed toward a pitch that gave him away to anyone with ears. "Have Pruitt sign the committal tomorrow. Get the old man behind a cell door where no paper out of Scotland can reach him." There it was. The second blunder of a man whose first blunder had been one careless word in a great hall, because Silas Crow, who had spent his whole life working in the patient dark, looked at the panic-kicking boy ordering crimes in broad daylight, with a magistrate already balking and a duke already roused, and understood, with the flat clarity of his trade, two things at once: that this client would not survive the scrutiny now coming, and that a careful man does not lie down in the same grave as the client who dug it. He said nothing. He bowed himself out, smooth as ever, and in the cold order of his East Wing room he opened his leather case, not to the forged ledgers now, but to the other thing he kept in it. The thing he had kept in it in 4 counties for 20 years, the careful private record, dated and detailed, of every instruction his client had ever given him. The book a clever man keeps not to use, but to hold over the day the weather turns. He read it through once, slowly, and he began to think, very precisely, about Edinburgh and about what a man in his position might still have to sell, and to whom a magistrate, by week's end, would most want to buy it. Far to the north, in a city of grey stone neither Crispin nor Crow had ever set eyes on, an exact dry old solicitor named Ewan Galbraith received a duke's steward at his door near midnight, heard 4 sentences, and reached at once for the strong-box that had held a dead earl's secret 3 years untouched. He had kept it because he had been asked to. He had asked no questions then. He intended now to ask none on the road south either, only to ride it, and to see a thing he had drawn up with his own hand, spent the way the man who paid for it had meant it spent. Price came home down the Brindley Lane at the 4th dusk, on a horse 3 counties had nearly killed, with a sealed packet strapped against his ribs and Galbraith's sworn, certified statement folded inside it. And behind him, by a hard-driven chaise that had spared neither springs nor purse, came the dry old Scot himself, arriving in the grey of the following morning. Exactly, the way such men always seem to, in time. The reckoning came that same morning, and it came in the great hall, because the Duke of Wexford willed it there, and no man in the county was minded to tell a duke no. The same hall scrubbed for his first visit, the same long table that had borne a lying map, and then 3 forged ledgers. He summoned them all to it. Crispin, sullen and overbright about the eyes. Crow, watchful, already standing half a pace nearer the door than an easy man would. Pruitt the magistrate, sweating gently before a word was spoken. Mrs. Hadley and the servants who had looked away in the yard. And Walter Hartley, brought in not as a prisoner, but to the Duke's own right hand, where the whole county marked it, and would not soon forget the marking, my Lord Ashmere. The Duke did not sit, and so no man in the room dared sit. 4 days passed. Your attorney laid 3 ledgers on this table and called this man a thief. I have come to lay a few things down beside them. Price unrolled the late Earl's deed. He set Galbraith's certified statement squares aside it. He laid the dead man's letter. I will trust the man who carried a stranger's child out of the flames, face up between them, for any soul in the hall who dared to bend and read it. The Western Farms, the Duke said. Holloway, Penn's Acre, the Long Meadow. They were never part of this estate's entail. Your great-uncle bought them with his own money, held them free, and 3 years before he died he settled them, lawfully, irrevocably, witnessed, into a trust to fund a parish school and to keep his oldest servant in his cottage and his dignity. He named one trustee in the whole world. He let it fall into the silence like a stone down a deep well. Mr. Hartley, the rents your books call waste, my lord, were never yours. For 3 years they were the trust's, and they reached the trust hole, and then a hand reached in and began taking them all the same. "That deed is a forgery," Crispin's voice cracked on it. "The old man forged it, the same as he forged. The old man forged nothing." The dry voice came from the doorway, where Galbraith had arrived in time, the way such men contrive to. "I am Ewan Galbraith. I drew that deed myself, 3 years before your great-uncle died, witnessed by 2 men yet living, and I have held its twin in my strong-box the whole while, where no hand at Ashmere could come near it. Set them side by side, my lords. They are the same to the comma." He crossed the floor and laid the original against Price's copy. "And while ye are comparing one thing, you'll wish to compare another." He set down a second sheaf, the trust's own accounts. Every rent off those 3 farms paid in by the tenants received whole in Edinburgh for 3 full years under the late earl, and not a penny short. Then the old earl dies. And from the very first quarter after his nephew takes the title, these last 10 months, my lords, and not 1 day more, a sum is drawn off before ever it reaches us. By a standing order, signed not by Mr. Hartley, who never in his life held the authority, but by the present Earl of Ashmere, Crispin Marlowe. In his own hand, the hall made a sound, low, the sound of 100 minds turning over at once, because the forgery built to hang Walter carried in it the one flaw no forger ever foresees. To frame an honest man for taking the rents, Crow's pen had written receipts into Walter's ledgers across the whole 3 years. But the trust's books, kept far away in a city no hand at Ashmere could touch, showed those first year's rents arriving whole and signed for in Edinburgh. So the forged receipts for those years were not merely false, they were impossible, proven liars on their face. And the only money that had in truth ever gone missing was the last 10 months of it, skimmed before it reached the north, by a standing order in the present Earl's own hand. The lie reached 3 years, the theft reached 10 months, and where the two finally overlapped, the forged receipts of those last quarters matched, to the very shilling, the sums Crispin Marlowe had drawn off in his own real script. They had to. He had told Crow what figures to write, and now the forgery and the standing order lay side by side on a duke's table. And they were, for those 10 months, the same numbers in 2 different hands. One of them a dead man's mercy, turned into a frame, and one of them a living man's signature on a charity's stolen purse. "You did not frame a thief, my lord," Walter Hartley said, quietly. Into the great hush, the first words he had spoken in that hall since the morning they had put him out of it. "You hired one to hide another, and the other was you." Crispin lunged for the deed. Price's hand closed on his wrist without apparent effort. The patient grip of a man who has spent 11 years being underestimated and is entirely done with it. And Pruitt the magistrate, who had come within an hour of signing committal against an old steward, found himself staring at a standing order, signed by an earl, that bled a charity for poor children into that earl's own pocket, and discovered, all at once, where his living truly came from. Not from the Marlowes, after all. From the law he had sworn an oath to keep. He reached for his pen with a hand that had begun, at last, to sweat for the right reason. And Silas Crow, who had read the turn 3 days before any other man in the room, stepped forward with the leather case he had carried into that house, like fair weather, and opened it and laid down upon the table not the forged ledgers now, but everything else. Every instruction Crispin had given him, every order, dated, detailed. The careful private record a careful private man keeps against exactly this morning. "In the interest of the court," said Crow, smooth to the very last, "I find I can no longer in conscience act for his lordship. I was, of course, deceived as to the true nature of the accounts. I place myself entirely at the magistrate's disposal." A small, graceful bow. A betrayal so complete and so quietly done that it took the room a long moment to see the blood on the floor. "You forged a man's own hand to the gallows, Mr. Crow," the Duke said, with a contempt so cold it scarcely stirred the air between them. "Conscience is a strange coat to discover at the door on your way out. You will wear the charge with the rest of them." "I broke no man," Crow said, and the pleasant mask slipped, for the first and final time, and what showed beneath it was nothing at all. A clerk doing arithmetic in the wreckage of other people's lives. "I only show the world the cracks a man was already carrying." "Then find yourself a glass," said Margaret Sutton. From the side of the hall, in her godfather's gentle voice, "and tell us what it shows." He had no answer. For the first time in 20 years and 4 counties, Silas Crow stood with no answer in his mouth, and a man whose whole trade had been the last word found that the last word had been taken clean out of him, and the silence where it should have been was the truest sentence the room could pass. It fell then, all of it, the way a dead man's careful mercy and a duke's cold patience and an old man's flat refusal to bend had built it to fall. Pruitt signed, not a committal against Walter, but warrants, against Crispin Marlowe, for the theft of trust funds raised for the poor, against Silas Crow, for forgery. Crispin was walked from the great hall of the house he had inherited and dishonored, no longer presiding over anything, his fine coat reduced of a sudden to mere cloth on a frightened young body. Crow followed, smiling at no one, already drafting his testimony in his head. And the county that had drawn its children back from an old thief stood in the yard and watched a young earl and a smiling lawyer carried off together in the same plain dark coach Crow had first arrived in, and understood slowly, the way crowds always understand things last, that they had hung the word useless on the wrong man and the word honest on another, and would have a great deal to be quiet about by supper. But vindication in a hall is a cold dish, and Walter Hartley had not yet been handed back the one warm thing he wanted in the world. She came up the lane that evening on her own 2 feet, Lucy. The news had reached town inside the hour. News of that size outruns any cart, and she had not waited for her father, nor for permission, nor for the morning. She had walked the 6 frozen miles in the dark, because her grandfather was at the end of them, and she came into the cottage where his furniture had been carried back indoors by ashamed hands, and she did not say a single word. She only crossed the room and put her arms around him and held on. 17, and fierce, and weeping, and Walter Hartley, who had not let himself break in the vestry or the great hall or the emptying lane, broke now, quietly, into his granddaughter's hair. Thomas came an hour behind her. He stood in the doorway, 40 years old, and could not at first make himself cross it. The careful, frightened man who had asked his father to confess by silence and leave the family name in peace. He looked at the furniture set right again, and the deed on the table, and the daughter he had tried to carry off to safety standing now, like a sentry at the old man's side, and the shame on his face had changed its kind. It was no longer the shame that hides. It was the shame that has finally turned round to look at itself. Father, his voice would not hold its shape. I asked you to be quiet, to save our name, and you stayed loud. To save, he could not finish it, to save the man who was too frightened to know he was worth the saving, Walter said. Yes. I did. I called you a thief in your own doorway. You called me a man you were terrified of losing, in the only language fear has ever learned to speak. Walter crossed to him. He did not take his son into his arms. Some distances close 1 inch at a time, and a wise father does not grab at them. He laid his hand on Thomas's arm, the way the dowager had once laid hers on his, the touch that says only I am still here, and so are you, and that will have to be enough to begin with. Come in, Thomas. Come and read your grandfather's master's letter. Come and learn what kind of a name it is you have spent your life so afraid for. It is a far better one than they ever let you know. And Thomas Hartley, 40 years old, came in and shut the door behind him soft and final, but this time the soft and final closing of that door did not shut a father out into the cold. This time it shut a family in, against it. They built the school that spring. Not the far-off, postponed spring of plans that never come. The near one, the April that followed hard on the frost. The trust held, Galbraith saw to it, dry and exact and quietly, fiercely pleased, and the rents of Holloway and Penn's Acre and the long meadow ran at last to the place a dead man had meant them to run. They raised it of good local stone on the Brindley Lane, a school and an almshouse both, a roof under which the parish poor might learn a trade and the parish old might keep their dignity to the end. And over the door they set the late Earl's name, because the mercy had been his, and Walter would take no credit that belonged to a dead friend. The Dowager Countess laid the first stone with her own dry hands, and called it, in a voice pitched to carry the length of the lane, the only wholly honest thing her family had built in a generation. Walter Hartley kept his cottage, he kept his name, and he kept his place, trustee of the Western Farms to his last day, which the village came round in time to calling the most useful office in the shire, held as it was by the very man they had all once been so certain was useless. Lucy stayed. Margaret Sutton, who had no place in the new order of things either, was given one that fit her exactly. And she ran the school, and ran it well, and the unwelcome truths she spoke in that gentle voice turned out to be the very truths a houseful of poor children most needed spoken. And Thomas came up from the county town every Sunday and learned, an inch at a season, the only honest pace there is, to be proud of a father who had stood in a duke's hall with nothing left but the truth, and answered to that and to nothing grander. Now, before we leave this old man at his own door, with the last of the light lying long across the meadow they once swore was waste, sit a moment with the thing his story was always truly about. Because it was never, in the end, about a deed or a forgery or a boy carried off in a dark coach. It was about a word, useless. How easily we reach for it and where we most reach. How quick we are to decide a man is finished, the very hour his hands slow and his stories begin to run long. to decide that the years which made him are the same years that have turned him into a burden. We set our old ones by the gate of our busy lives. We speak across them in their own rooms. And we forget, this is the whole of it, the whole quiet lesson of it. We forget that the one who has stood in a place the longest is the one who knows where the true papers are buried. That a lifetime of being walked past is, for the man being walked past, a lifetime of seeing plainly what no one performing for an audience ever sees at all. A man's worth is not a wage the world pays out to him while he is useful and stops when he is not. It is a thing he keeps in his own two hands, long after the world has quit its counting. And if he is patient, and if he is fortunate, there comes one morning when the world is made to count it again, all at once, and is left ashamed of how long it let itself go on not looking. It makes you wonder, how many useful men have we called useless? How many watchmen have we named the thief? How many people have we set quietly aside by the gate of our own hurried days, certain they had nothing left to give us, only because we had stopped troubling to ask? So tell me, before you go, have you ever been the one left standing by the gate, written off, talked over, treated as a burden while you still had the whole of yourself left to give? Or did you watch it done to someone you loved and wish, far too late, that you had stood up in the hall and said so out loud? Tell me about it down below. I read every word that comes. And tell me this while you were there. Of all of them in this story, which one did you most want to see carried off in that dark coach? Stay close. The next tale I have to tell you is one I have been keeping a long while, and it begins, as the best of them do, with a man everyone had already decided was finished.